in this moment. Is that loud? I feel it's good. In this moment, I can't help but think about popcorn. If you ever make stovetop popcorn, the instructions are when you're near the end, how you know it's the end is if there's more than 4 seconds between the next kernel popping, and if you count to 4 after a pop and there's nothing left, then usually that's when it's ready to be taken off the stove. And so I was sitting here waiting, being mindful of waiting in my body. And then I thought, oh, I could start now. But then someone would walk in. And I said, okay, not now. And then I found myself counting to 4. And then I thought, okay, I'll start. And then someone else would come in. So I thought I'd share that with you. So congratulations, you're at the end of your 3rd full day. Not to be underestimated, it's more than what a lot of people give themselves to stop, to cultivate the qualities that we're cultivating, like patience, wholesome restraint maybe, mindfulness, wisdom, kindness, as well as cultivating or intending to cultivate a relationship as well with Kuan Yin and the Kuan Yin Dhammas. So I just want to start this evening with reading from the Simsapa Sutta. On one occasion, the Buddha was staying with a group of disciples in a Simsapa forest in Kosambi. He reached down, picking up a handful of leaves. He then asked those gathered, "What is greater in number, the leaves in my hand or those in the trees?" The disciples replied, "The leaves in your hand are few. The trees have many more." Then the Buddha replied, "Just as the leaves in the trees are more numerous, the things that I know from direct knowledge are far more numerous than what I teach as my Dhamma. The reason I do not teach these other things is that they are not part of my Dhamma. They are not related to my Dhamma, and they do not support the principles of a life integrated with the Eightfold Path. These other things do not lead to disenchantment, to dispassion, to calm, to direct knowledge, to cessation, or to self-awakening. These other things do not lead to unbinding from views ignorant of the Four Noble Truths. I teach Four Noble Truths." And so that's what I'm going to try to share with you this evening. However, in one hand, these are the Buddha's basic teachings, and on the other hand, the Four Noble Truths encapsulate the entirety of the Buddhist path. So we'll see what unfolds. And I'll do my best as well to remind you that you have a body. It might be something that you've been working with and are very aware of all day. However, I find that sometimes the Dharma talk, especially after dinner, in the evenings, before bed, it could have, at least in my daily routine, have the feel of like, let's cozy in and watch an episode of something. And then that's when I kind of disembody. And so I'll remind you as often as I remember that I have a body, to remind you that you have a body. And so how about we start with that now? And basically, when I say there is a body, it's just remembering or touching into, bringing to awareness the parts of your body that might be attracting your attention or that are touching the ground. Maybe there's fatigue you notice, or a lot of energy, or contraction, or expansion. But it's just this light touch of recognizing, oh yeah, as I listen, there is this body. So the Four Noble Truths, in case you're unfamiliar with them, because I recognize that a lot of times on retreats we mention other teachings, or we mention teachings without necessarily going into them. And so the Four Noble Truths are, the first truth is the Noble Truth of suffering, or dukkha. The second Noble Truth is the Noble Truth of the cause of suffering, samudaya. The third Noble Truth is of the end of suffering, nirodha. And then the fourth Noble Truth is the Noble Truth of the path that ends suffering, magga. And then these truths are called noble because they can liberate us from suffering. That is its potential. And so the first Noble Truth, the truth of dukkha. So dukkha, you might be somewhat familiar with this term. And if you're not familiar with the term, most certainly you're familiar with the concept, because I think we soak in it at least a little bit every day, and on retreat, maybe a lot. And in a lot of ways, it's defined or translated as suffering. It could be pain, sickness, injury, tiredness, old age, death, sadness, fear, frustration, disappointment, etc. And even though all that I just named were, I would say, classify as unpleasant, dukkha can also arise from pleasant. So for example, you might have pleasant experiences like ease or comfort or happiness, but dukkha can be related to them because they're impermanent. And so suffering, when that changes, suffering can arise too. But it's not all, as I say that out loud, I'm like, gosh, that's such a downer, but it's not all a downer. I think that in a lot of ways, or I hear this a lot of times, and maybe you have too, if ever you've told anyone that you're maybe going to a Buddhist meditation retreat or interested in Buddhism at all, some people might say, oh, isn't that the one that's like all about suffering? Life is suffering, something like that. And I think that's a misunderstanding and an unfortunate shorthand, basically, because in these teachings, there's just so much beauty. It's not just that life is suffering. Dukkha comes from Pali, and whenever I use dictation devices, whenever it says, I say Pali, it spells it as P-O-L-L-Y, Pali, but it's not Pali, it's P-A-L-I, which is the language that the Buddhist teachings were recorded. But in Pali, dukkha is often translated as bad or wrong space. So it's not just pain and misery, but it's translated, or it means bad or wrong space. And at the time of the Buddha, it was used to describe the axle of a wheel of an ox cart. And in particular, when that axle was misaligned, that was dukkha, because with a misaligned axle, that ox cart would just have like a really bumpy ride, basically. So it was off center, literally in a bad space. But even though I can imagine that, I don't have experience in riding in an ox cart. So I think a modern day example of that would be where you go to a grocery store and you have that one wheel that's like wonky or that doesn't roll. I always think of dukkha, or like when I go to IKEA and I'm like fighting with the cart, that's a little bit that same sense, that same image. But life isn't just suffering, as I hope you're touching into, and I'm pretty sure you are already experiencing. If life was only suffering, I think we would be burnt out, and that there wouldn't be this many people on a retreat doing what we're doing, basically. I much prefer the translation or the interpretation of life includes suffering when it comes to this noble truth of dukkha. Another definition that I like is being separated from that which we love. Or Juna's definition from this morning, being apart from the whole, being separated from the whole. And basically it really points to this is part of the human experience. With each of the noble truth, there's an invitation or a task. And with this noble truth of dukkha, the invitation is to understand it, to really get to know it, this dynamic of suffering. So in a lot of ways, the first step in understanding dukkha is the simple recognition of, ouch, this sucks. But of course, that can be really challenging because we're being asked to be with this unpleasant experience, this experience of suffering, being separated from that which we love, of dis-ease, instead of trying to move on from it quickly, which we might have that habit pattern, or we might tend to do in our daily life. Or we might tell ourselves this shouldn't be happening, or we might judge ourselves even for it. And then the natural human tendency is that when it's unpleasant, we want less of it. We want to move on from it. And so, as a result, with this invitation of staying with, or understanding, or being with it, it's asking for us to do quite a significant shift, actually, in our practice. Because in a way, it's asking us to turn from, no, I don't want this, or it should be another way, into, yes, and this too. And so this transforming the no into a yes is actually a huge step, and it's not an easy step. However, once we're able to do that, then we can have a bit more ease, because the fighting, the resistance, the fighting it is no longer there. And even though I say we can have a little more ease, it doesn't mean that it's going to be pleasant. For example, I'm struggling with my left knee. And so the pain is still there. It's just that I'm not fighting the pain. I'm not forcing myself necessarily to sit in postures that I think I should be sitting in, or making stories about this knee pain or whatnot. So a big piece of this First Noble Truth, or working with it, is turning that no into a yes. And then from there are other steps that might feel smaller, but are still quite significant. For example, it's to understand it, but to also to turn it from a no to a yes, and then to really feel it, to feel into your experience of it. At the same time, it could feel incredibly challenging, because even though I use knee pain that is fairly manageable, a lot of us are not sitting with something like that. It could be maybe a lot of emotional or mental pain that might be with us on retreat. And so this invitation of understanding it, turning a no into a yes, and feeling into it, the experience, can almost feel like, at least for me, can feel almost like I'm sitting in the fire. It could be really, really challenging. However, the way that I interpret the fire is that the fire, or that sensation, for me at least, is like it's burning up old ways of being and seeing, and it's making way for something new. And that new thing is new ways of meeting future suffering. And so our title for the retreat is Refuge, Resilience, Presence, and Love in Our Times. And that being able to be with experience and have it transform into a new way of meeting future suffering, that's part of the resilience that we're cultivating together. There was one of my long retreats that I did. I think this one, it was a 6-week retreat a few years ago. And 2 days before that retreat, my now ex, but not ex at that time, we were together for, I think at that time, 7 years. So 2 days before that retreat, he told me that he wanted to break up, which was, in my opinion, very bad timing, because I was going to be in silence for 6 weeks. And at the best of times, even with all of the coping mechanisms and support systems, some news like that had the potential to be really captivating, let's say. And so, of course, on retreat, the frequent visitors that were very persistent, that retreat included uncertainty, sadness, fear, hope, anger. So there's a lot of stuff. And so that was dukkha, I would say. And I share this with you just so that I could maybe share a snapshot of how I worked with it, or how I was with it on that retreat, just because sometimes I think Thanisra and both Juna brought this up in their meditations or talks, but just how sometimes we could have the tendency to be on retreat, and we recognize that this is a gift. Being on retreat, meditating, giving this to ourselves is not something many people do, and we might not have a lot of opportunity to do this. And so I've seen this a lot where some people will come in and then they'll say, this big thing happened in work or in my life, and I have 7 days to figure it out. Like, I really want to solve it and get over it and have this retreat somehow transform my whole relationship to that thing. Which is a great recipe for dukkha as well, because it's putting a lot of pressure on yourself, to say the least. So just in case that you came to retreat to meditate on something, and I'm using air quotes if you're not looking, because I hear that a lot, just wanting to share how we might be with what we want to, quote unquote, meditate on differently. And so back to that story. 2 days before my retreat, I get told that. And so on my retreat, what was happening was a lot of times my go-to is breath awareness. And so I was being mindful of my breath. And then the thought of this news would arise, and it would linger. And I would try to be with it because I knew the First Noble Truth. And sometimes it would pass away. It wasn't very compelling or captivating, and that thought would pass. And so sometimes that thought was there momentarily, and other times it wasn't there at all. And I tried to notice those moments too when it was absent. And sometimes when it arose, it felt like it was there forever. And it was like this big black hole that I would get really stuck in. But I tried not to process, and again, using air quotes around process. I wasn't trying to process it. I was doing my best at noticing when there was a rising and passing away of this thought. The thing is, it was arising a lot and passing away just as much, but maybe not as quickly as I wanted it to pass away, or not on my timeline or my watch, my agenda. And so sometimes I was able to be with it, and sometimes I was lost in it. And that was just the nature of it. I really appreciated what Juna said this morning about the hindrances, that I don't have my notebook with me now, but something along the lines that the hindrances are nature. And that's a really compassionate teaching, because when it arises, it can feel very personal. And so that's what it felt like. It was nature, and at the same time, it felt very personal. And so sometimes I was able to meet the thought spot on with this clarity, with this spaciousness, where there's this quality of presence that allowed me to really feel into it. And there are other times where I was just so stuck in the mess of it. It was like quicksand. And that was my practice, that retreat. That was a lot of it, that sometimes I was able to have this clarity and spaciousness and others not. And part of my task was also to be compassionate with myself. That sometimes when I was lost in it, it wasn't my fault. But to do my best, basically, to meet the suffering, to turn the no into the yes, and to feel into that experience. It certainly felt like I was getting knocked to my knees over and over and over and over and over and over for 6 weeks, and then some. But it really took, and I feel like a lot of you know this already, but it takes this willingness and this humility to show up again and again and again. Adam and I co-taught together in July, and there was a quote that he said that I'm not going to get perfectly, but that I'm remembering, and it was something like, we fall 8 times and we get up 9. And so that's what it felt like, or that's what it might feel like when it comes to meeting our dukkha, or this noble truth of dukkha. Do you remember that you have a body? There is a body. Tune into it. How is it now? And so the second noble truth is the noble truth of the cause of sufferings, samudaya. And samudaya refers to the roots of suffering, the cause of suffering, which is clinging, craving, thirst. It could be this craving of wanting to be, not wanting to be, wanting to have, not wanting to have, wanting the meditation or the retreat to be finished, not wanting to go home. It could a whole range of things. And it's not that things are ephemeral and always changing that is the problem or a problem. It's wanting it to be different or wanting it to be permanent that causes the problems or the complications. In a lot of ways, this one is hard, the clinging part, because we could be very loyal to our suffering. In a lot of ways, so I didn't expect it to be this, but it's almost like therapy, although I've processed it, in therapy. But we did break up in the end, if anyone was wondering. But but I remember when I was going through the grieving process, and after months, I recognized that there was healing, but I noticed the thought as well where I was holding on, I was even clinging to my grieving, so I was loyal to my suffering, because I believed that it helped me stay connected to what I didn't want happening. I didn't want the separation to happen, and I believed that it would help me stay connected somehow. A Burmese teacher, Sayadaw U Tejaniya, calls it, we're nostalgic for samsara. And he also says that our sense of self is looking for ways to keep itself defined. I think it was last night Tanisha had mentioned something fairly simple, but just like how our minds can be so fast at creating stories and drama. And so you might be experiencing a lot of peace and calm, and may it continue. And there are still ways that this might be showing up for you. For example, there could be someone that's breathing in a way that is just bugging you, or someone wearing loud pants or something like that. I remember on retreat, there was someone who was wearing swishy track pants. Drove me nuts. But, and so we could almost say like that breather or that person with the pants, Spirit Rock should really screen people on how they breathe or what clothes they wear, and only accept, the people with cotton or silent breathers or something like that. But because in a way we're protected by silence, we can't necessarily march up and file a complaint. And so as a result, what sometimes happens is we have a full day of meditation. And this, I'm speaking from experience. And so instead, I spend my day concocting a plan of just like the perfectly worded note to the managers that isn't too demanding, that is kind, but that is firm at the same time. And then trying not to sound like a nut either, that I'm upset about someone's pants or how they breathe. I never did follow through with writing a note, because thankfully mindfulness at some point kicked in, and it really made it clear the pain of clinging to my views and clinging to my pleasantness. That was so apparent in that experience. And then as well, I found that the mindfulness or the wisdom also arose because I was just exhausted. I was so tired of fighting and spending all my energy on this thing, writing the note and maybe even though we're not making eye contact, making evil eyes or something to that person. And in a way, if I go back to the Simsapa Sutta, where the Buddha says, these other things do not lead to disenchantment, dispassion, to calm, to direct knowledge, to cessation, or to self-awakening. I think in that moment where I was just so exhausted with the fighting, that was a little bit that disenchantment. And so it was kind of like, fine, wear your pants, breathe however you want to breathe. And so ultimately, nothing really changed other than my clinging to my views and my pleasantness, and clinging to my pleasantness. So everything stayed the same, it's just the clinging was gone. And then there was, in that release or in that surrender in a way, what arose was spaciousness for something like, this is just how it is right now, to arise. And of course, I'm using retreat examples, but you can change the characters and change the storyline to whatever might be arising for you on this retreat. The task for this truth is to abandon craving or clinging. So abandon. It's release of any grasping. A Spirit Rock teacher, Conda Mason, I just heard her say once, in order to let go, we need to learn how to loosen our grip first. And so it could be simply loosening our grip. And I think what we're doing is creating the conditions for our grip to loosen. I love this quote from Ajahn Chah. Do you see this glass? I love this glass. It holds the water admirably. When the sun shines on it, it reflects the light beautifully. When I tap it, it has a lovely ring. Yet for me, this glass is already broken. When the wind knocks it over, or my elbow knocks it off the shelf and it falls to the ground and shatters, I say, of course. But when I understand that this glass is already broken, every minute with it is precious. So going back to my 6-week retreat, what started happening was I began to see clearly what was really going on. That craving was there, craving for some certainty, and craving for that certainty to be immediate, basically. And the craving was also manifesting as this obsessive thought loop. And what was really happening was the thought would arise, it was unpleasant. Because it was unpleasant, I was resisting it. And then because it was unpleasant and there was resistance, and there was also unpleasant physical sensations. So it was just like the snowball effect, basically. And then part of that was just me internally screaming, no, I do not want any of this. I do not want the situation, the thought, the reactivity, none of it, basically. But then, again, at some point, there was clear seeing. There was spaciousness to see, oh, this is what's happening. There's the thought, there's resistance, there's unpleasant physical sensations, a strong not wanting. Okay, so this is what's going on. And then seeing that over and over and over allowed wisdom to begin to do its work, which is really the work of the second noble truth, that abandoning. And so just want to emphasize that wisdom does the abandoning. We don't, but wisdom does. I think Tanisra said last night, the fruit arises according to the Dhamma, not our agenda. And so it's really that. And so when people say, let go, or let it go, especially if it's like, I don't know, a friend who's like, oh, that's what's going on, just let it go. It's just like saying relax to me. It's like no one in the history has ever relaxed from being told to relax, I think. But anyways, so it's similar, let it go. Because it almost implies like we have control over the letting go. And it's almost as if, oh, that's all I'm supposed to do? I didn't think of it. I don't know. It just really bugs me, as you can see. But anyways. And so what I like, I prefer instead let it be, because the letting it be, we're not fighting. And then that allows for wisdom to do this work. And again, it doesn't happen on our own timetable. I sometimes think of it as when we might be clinging. So I'm just going to demonstrate with my hands. In case you're not looking, I'll also try to describe it. But basically, I think that sometimes our clinging is like coming into practice or retreat with this fist. And sometimes, so my other hand is our retreat practice, our meditation practice. And so sometimes we think, okay, with my retreat practice, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pry the clinging open, and I have 7 days, 8 days to do it. However, it doesn't work like that, as a lot of us might have learned or are learning the hard way. Instead, what we're doing with our practice is we're supporting what feels hard to let go of. So we're letting it be, and we're creating the conditions for the letting go to happen, basically. So the opening to happen. And so in a way, when I saw this, it was somewhat of a relief, even though it was still unpleasant what I was navigating. But it was somewhat of a relief because I didn't have to do anything. I just had to continue showing up with sincerity, with humility, with this willingness to start over, even though I would get lost in it a lot of times. So in a lot of ways, the effort isn't in the letting go, air quotes, it's in the repetition, in the redirection, in the sincerity to begin again. I just want to note as well that sometimes mindfulness gets overwhelmed. So just as maybe a disclaimer, that sometimes what we might be navigating on retreat can feel so intense that it could feel almost like the image that I often give, because it feels like this. It's like what we're navigating is this pot of boiling water, and it's been boiling a long time, so there's a lot of bubbles on the top. And sometimes we think, let me just be mindful of it. And that's almost like putting on the lid, but the lid is clanging, and we're kind of trying to shut the lid or keep the lid shut on it. And so that's at least my experience, or I imagine it feels like when my mindfulness gets overwhelmed. And then on top of it, it could be like, but all my food is made for me. It's a peaceful place. I have all the tools. I thought I'm doing it right. What's going wrong? And so then there's more suffering even. And then for me, the overriding the mindfulness overwhelm and just being like, let me try being mindful of thoughts. Let me try this. Loving kindness. I was like doing everything. But not realizing my mindfulness was overwhelmed. And so I actually ended up getting on that retreat a lot of panic and anxiety attacks as well from the over-efforting. And so if it ever feels like it's too much, Juna pointed to this morning in her instructions, but some things that helped me were to bring in self-compassion, to remind myself that it's okay, that it feels like it's too much, and to do things like open the eyes, look out the window, or during movement or walking meditations, I found it really helpful to do fast walking, to move some of that energy, basically. So I find that I don't often hear that mindfulness can get overwhelmed. And when my mindfulness is getting overwhelmed, I think I'm wrong, I've done something bad, etc. But it can happen. And so those are some of the things how you might support yourself. There is a body. The third noble truth of Nirodha, the noble truth of the end of suffering. So Nirodha means cessation or stopping. And it's when reactivity ceases, suffering ceases. So when there's no clinging, there's no suffering. And this can be quite huge, especially if you think, wow, okay, if all of life is suffering, if we use that translation, and that all I have to do to end all the suffering is to stop being reactive, great. Like, I got this. I'm only going to do this. And so we might think, or we might look for this grandiose experience. And so I remember on that same retreat, I was meditating in this room that was like this kind of almost like a living room. And I started meditating where it was like late afternoon. And I don't know how long I was practicing for, but it had turned into evening and it was dark. And so I was practicing. And then at one point, bright lights. And then I thought, this is it. Like, I've arrived. And then I thought, but wait, if this is it, would I be thinking this is it? And so there was maybe some wise doubt there, because I opened my eyes and it was just someone who turned on the light in the room that I was in. So it doesn't need to, in case you're only looking for grandiose experiences, it doesn't need to be the cessation of suffering. Again, as I mentioned earlier, life includes suffering. It's not only suffering, because if it was, we'd be burnt out. And so I am confident that you already are experiencing moments that are free from suffering, when there's no reactivity in the mind, when there's simply a quality of presence. The thing is we tend to overlook it because we're conditioned to only or mostly see the unpleasant or the bad, which is a survival mechanism that we've inherited. Sometimes, though, when there is no reactivity in the mind, we could even take it maybe for granted. I know that I have on past retreats where when I feel a state of calm, I might think, well, yeah, I took a week off work to feel this calm. It's about time it arose. And so I'm not even really being with the experience of calm. Instead, I'm just kind of, overlooking it, taking it for granted. And yet, when we're able to notice these moments of freedom, even though they might be small or short, noticing them leads to bigger moments of freedom. And so it's like going to the gym. We lift maybe light weights at first in order to prepare ourselves to lift bigger weights. And so noticing these smaller moments can lead to noticing these bigger moments. And that's the task of this third noble truth, to realize these moments. And again, just emphasizing, it doesn't need to be grandiose. Again, Sayadaw U Tejaniya talks about wise effort in a way where the amount of effort we really need when we practice, or to even be able to notice these moments of freedom, is the same amount of effort we need to know that our 10 fingertips are touching when we bring them together. So as an experiment, let's do that now, if you like. So bring all 10 fingertips together. You can either close your eyes or look away from your hands and just notice how much awareness you need to know or you need to have in order to recognize your fingertips are touching. And then you can release your hands. So most of us didn't need to furrow our brow or press our fingertips together until our fingers were white to know that they were touching. And Kittisaro talked about that a little bit when he spoke of the lute player. So just that right amount of effort. And then the last noble truth, the noble truth of the path to the end of suffering, Magga. Magga meaning path. And the task for this is to cultivate it, which is good news, you're already doing. And so, I don't know if someone said yay, but at least I heard that, but yeah. And so mindfulness alone doesn't do it. So I just want to make that distinction, that mindfulness is actually part of a system, and it's the system or this path that is caring. And it includes many things like wise view, which is knowing, or one example of wise view is that knowing our thoughts, words, and actions, when they're rooted in greed or hate, they cause harm. When they're rooted in generosity and kindness, then they can have beneficial consequences. There's also things like skillful intention, like intentions for kindness, harmlessness, and renunciation from clinging. There's also helpful action, livelihood, speech, skillful effort, mindfulness, concentration, which is basically the Eightfold Path. And if you're like me, and when there's a list of 3 or more items, you forget half of the list, if that happens to you, all you have to remember is that this path, or what we can cultivate, is turning the no into a yes, to allow wisdom to do its job. and the job of abandoning so that we can touch into and feel more freedom. At the same time, though, even though I'm talking about our own practice here, it's not the be-all and end-all. It's just the beginning. To go back to something Kittasaro shared on a couple nights ago, quoting from Professor Martin Verhoeven, we are making ourselves agents of change here and now in this world, in this time, in this thought and deed. Change your heart, change the world. And so that's what we're doing. We're turning toward teachings like the Four Noble Truths or Eightfold Paths, Kuan Yin Dhammas, as a way to change our heart. Because I firmly believe, and this is why I practice and why I teach, that when we start with ourselves, it then leaks into our communities. But to not stop there, not stop when it benefits us only directly, but to keep going. And I believe we have what it takes in these practices and in these teachings for a collective change and for collective freedom, so that all beings, no one excluded, no one exploited, can benefit from these teachings. I'll end with this quote from Valerie Kaur, that the author, activist. She spoke at an event that Tanisra was teaching at. It was an online thing 2 years ago for around Mind Your Vote or something like that. And Valerie Kaur shared this beautiful story. And then toward the end had said something like, it's undeniable that we are living, that times are dark. But the question becomes, is this the darkness of the womb or the darkness of the tomb? And so I believe that's what we're practicing for, so that we are contributing to this being the darkness of the womb. Thank you for your attention. Just sit for a brief moment and once again remember that we have a body, and let any words sink in. Release any clinging to any words, resting in knowing that this is also recorded if you need. Thank you. So the usual time for some movement or walking practice. Some of you might choose to rest. If you want to continue practicing, there is the 9 p.m. Last formal practice together in half an hour. Thank you.